On a cold and windy day almost 200 years ago, a man named Meyer Moses stood up at a meeting and declared, "Collect together thy long scattered people, and let their gathering place be in this land of milk and honey." He was referring to a land where Jews were offered dignity and equality. The year was 1806. That land was the United States of America. Over 350 years ago, Jews from locations as diverse as Europe, the Caribbean, and Brazil came to North America in search of economic opportunity, freedom, and in many cases, a new beginning. In honor of this 350-year anniversary, the Jewish Theological Seminary Choir practiced some of the melodies of the time that were performed at a colonial-era Shabbat service.
Jewish life in the New World begins as part of a great wave, which is a Jewish migration from the East to the West. It was part of the age of colonialization, the penetration of Europe, of the New World, and Jews were part of that movement that dispersed human population.
Over the next 170 years, Jews developed a significant presence in 6 American colonies in North America.
The colonies of Jews that existed in North America on the eve of the American Revolution shared a number of characteristics. First, with the exception of Richmond, which was really the latest of the 6 original Jewish congregations, all Atlantic ports. So these were people from the wealthiest to the poorest who had some connection to trade. And they had an important place in those colonies and in those cities by virtue of their relationships to transatlantic or para-Atlantic trade. Jews in each one of the colonies had networks among themselves. A great deal linked them. They had relationships, they shared family, they shared all sorts of institutions, but they didn't necessarily see a difference between themselves and Jews in the West Indies. They all maintained relationships back with Amsterdam and London. So there really was this Jewish world that the Atlantic served as the kind of Jewish sea, linking the Jews in all of these colonies.
In the 1600s, Jews had settled in the New World in, among other places, the Dutch colony of Recife in Brazil. There, Jews, as was common in Amsterdam, lived in relative equality, allowed to practice their religion openly.
The reason that New Amsterdam is first is that Jews were forced to leave Recife in Brazil, which had been a Dutch colony where large numbers of Jews actually had settled when the Dutch conquered it from the Portuguese in 1630, and they're forced to leave in 1654 when the Portuguese conquered back from the Dutch, bring with it the Inquisition. Basically, the Jews, and it's often forgotten, the Protestants, are given 3 months to leave. Like sensible people, they took the hint.
Some of them returned to Amsterdam, but 23 of them boarded the St. Catherine and sailed to New Amsterdam.
They went there because it was Dutch, and indeed, when they seek permission to settle, they say, listen, we supported you in the battle at Recife. We've been very good citizens. We shed blood on your behalf. You owe it to us.
When the Jews arrived in 1654 in New Amsterdam, they found a very hostile authority to greet them, namely the governor of the place, Peter Stuyvesant, who was the governor of all of New Netherland, which stretched from places in New Jersey all the way up to Albany, New York. But Stuyvesant also opposed Christians who were not members of the Calvinist branch of Protestantism. What he evidently envisioned was a kind of uniform population and social system within New Netherland. He even took steps against Lutherans and Quakers and Mennonites, but certainly as well against the Jews.
He wrote to the directors of the Dutch West India Company to give him permission to expel the Jews. But the tiny Jewish population also had well-situated connections in the company.
And over the objections of Governor Peter Stuyvesant, the Dutch West India Company, among whose shareholders were not a few Jews, the Dutch West India Company orders him to allow the Jews to remain.
By and large, they were coming to America for the lure of economic opportunity. And in a way, I think that the economic basis of the migration in some ways makes a much more exciting story and makes them much more real people for us as we try to understand who they were and what they did. These weren't people without options. For example, the first group that come to New Amsterdam, they had the option of going back to Amsterdam. But the colonies in North America were a place where somebody could get in on the ground floor. There were vast stretches of land for fur and for other resources. Interestingly, they become assertive about their political rights. When they sue for the right to stand with the militia, the watch to guard the city, they're saying, we are part of this community.
In 1655, Asher Levy sought to enlist in the militia. He was refused, and instead, along with other Jews, was ordered to pay a tax because of their exemption. Declining to pay, he petitioned for the right to stand guard, which he was ultimately granted. He was one of the first Jews to own land in what are now known as Albany and New York City.
I think what's very interesting where they don't demand rights is in the realm of religion, because the impositions that had been imposed upon them were in some ways very artificial and didn't reflect the needs for the practice of Judaism. So in New Amsterdam, where the authorities said that they couldn't have a synagogue, the Jews didn't care because they didn't need it. They could worship privately, and that was just as good as having a public house of worship. They did ask for the right to have a cemetery, which really was much more fundamental to the practice of Judaism than having a public building marked synagogue.
In 1655, there were at least 13 male Jews in New Amsterdam, and they petitioned for a plot of land for a cemetery, one of the first steps for a congregation about to embark on communal institutions.
In 1656, we have reference to the fact that they bought land for cemetery. We don't know exactly where that land is, but the oldest cemetery that we have down on Chatham Square, the earliest stone dates back to 1683.
Chatham Square is the congregation's second cemetery.
The synagogues served as the central address for Jewish life in the colonial and early national periods. That meant that they provided for the goods and services needed by individual Jews. The most important was a cemetery plot. The synagogues controlled the Jewish cemetery plots. And if one was not a member in good standing of the synagogue, one would not be buried in the Jewish cemetery, which was a lever that the community had with the families of individuals who passed away.
Shortly after the English took over the colony in 1664, Jews were eventually allowed to worship in public.
The challenge that was faced by Jews when they arrived was how they were going to create vibrant Jewish communities in a setting that functioned on the basis of voluntarism. They had to voluntarily band together to create institutions to benefit themselves and also for worship. And they found a method to introduce compulsion into Jewish life via the synagogues.
During the 75 years between the arrival of Jews in New Amsterdam and the building of the first permanent synagogue structure in the New World, Jews worshipped in homes and followed the ritual observances such as circumcision, koshering meat, matzah for Passover, all the time balancing their religious and secular lives.
This community worships in probably private homes at first, rented homes later on, and then in 1728 they began to build a synagogue, and in 1730 they dedicated their first building structure, the Mill Street Synagogue, and we can actually see that. It appears on the map.
And that was the first synagogue building built in North America. If you look at our small synagogue, you'll see it's fairly small. The first building was 50 feet by 50 feet square, and that was able to house all of the Jews of New York City. So maybe we're talking about 100, 150 people or so.
Although the Mill Street Synagogue no longer exists, some of its furnishings are housed at the Little Synagogue of Shereth, Israel.
We use a Little Synagogue for daily services, and it's a visible reminder of our connection with the colonial Jewish experience in New York.
It's conventional to refer to the early periods of American Jewish history as the Sephardic era. But in fact, already in the early 1700s, the majority of the Jews living in North America were of Ashkenazic background. Nonetheless, the Sephardim dominated the Jewish community. They were the leaders of the community, and their synagogue rituals dominated the way in which all the synagogues operated during the colonial and even the early national periods of American Jewish history.
Many years ago, when I began serving as a student rabbi, then the assistant rabbi of this congregation, I spent my days reading the early archives of the congregation, including the minute books that go back to colonial days. And I was amazingly impressed by the fact that on the top of many pages, it would say in beautiful handwriting, "In the name of Almighty God, the Lord of Israel, Amen," or some similar phrase. They call themselves Shereth Israel, the remnant of Israel, because they saw themselves as a little group of Jewish people in a faraway, remote area, and they saw themselves as being very faithful to the traditions of the Jewish people. At the same time, they recognized that they were, in some way, distinctively modern Jews. They weren't coming out of ghettos. They were the first Jews in modern times who had real sense of their own dignity and freedom. They felt the right to participate in society. They demanded the right to participate in society at large.
Abigail Franks and her husband, Jacob Franks, were leaders of New York's tiny Jewish community. She confronted head-on the struggle of maintaining a religious life alongside a secular one in her desire for her children to marry only in the Jewish faith.
Abigail Franks, who was the great letter writer of colonial Jewry, who told her son Naphtali when he went to England that he should never eat anything in his uncle's house because she didn't trust his kashrut. She gives us such a wonderful portrait of that colonial world. Her spirit was utterly crushed when her daughter Phila married outside of the faith, married Oliver Delancey, so we learned something about the struggles of that community with intermarriage.
Yet at the same time, Abigail Franks wanted to read English literature, to have non-Jewish friends, and she did, and be part of the larger society.
The small number of Jewish colonists caused some to abstain from marriage or intermarry.
When we study a period that we think is so distant from our lives today, we learn that actually the Jews then faced so many of the same challenges that we face today. Challenges of intermarriage, challenges of survival in a free society. And we can gain insight by looking at what they were struggling with then. We can also take comfort to know that We Jews have survived and are thriving here today.
One leader of Shearith Israel was integral to the survival of the community.
In 1768, the congregation employed Reverend Gershom Mendesatius to be its chazan, or religious leader. Gershom Mendesatius was actually born in New York and was trained in the synagogue school. He led the congregation for periods spanning 50 years, including the period of the American Revolution. A very intelligent person. We have some of his sermons. He was active in all phases of city life as well as Jewish life, and he represented the Jewish community to the non-Jewish community outside.
Because the synagogues had controlled all resources, therefore it put a great deal of power in the hands of the tight little clique of the Parnasim, the wealthy merchants who ran the congregations, and they attempted to control people's lives. Certainly, I think by contemporary standards, we'd say that they really meddled on a kind of micro level, trying to find out if Hetty Hayes's boarding house was in fact serving food that was not kosher. The delegation went to visit and look in her pots.
Synagogue life in Europe, as well as in colonial America, was largely governed by the well-to-do. Rabbis played a significant role in this process in the European context because there they served as judges and adjudicators of Jewish law, and even more important, as the administrators of the Jewish community. In the American framework, rabbis only arrived well into the 1830s, and as a result of that, the lives of the synagogues revolved around the activities of lay leaders of the communities. And these lay leaders also tried to exercise control over the membership by passing regulations, by requiring Jews to pay fines if they acted out, if they misbehaved. But there were many Jews who simply did not pay those fines.
One of the founding families of New York's Jewish community was the Nathans, of which Edgar Nathan is a descendant.
Before the Revolution, the first Nathan came, a man named Simon Nathan. He was a merchant, came to this country. He married Gershom Mendesatius' sister and became an integral and important part of New York and American life. He enlisted in the militia during the Revolution. He was a man of some substance. He financed a good part of the Revolution, certainly for one individual or family, so much so that he was in severe financial straits. Nobody was able to repay him.
As the New York Jewish community developed, it had the desire to extend its horizons.
One of the earliest demands of the Jewish settlers in New Amsterdam was for the right of trade beyond the city itself and to have access to the immense riches of the Hudson River Valley, the furs, the timber, all the access to the Indian trade. That was really where the money was to be made, and they didn't want to be cut out of that, so they were very assertive about their economic rights.
In the early 1700s, Luis Gomez petitioned and was awarded denization papers, the rights to trade and own land.
The Gomez Mill House in upstate New York is one of the oldest physical artifacts that we have of the early American Jewish presence. It's probably the second oldest, only exceeded in age by the cemetery in New York City that belongs to the Shearith Israel congregation. One of the leading members of Shearith Israel in the late 1600s and early 1700s, an individual who had left Spain, no doubt because of inquisitional problems, was Luis Gomez. He and his many sons established what was the leading Sephardic Jewish family in New York City. And to make their livings, the Gomezes traded extensively across the length and breadth of the Atlantic Ocean. And in order to supply that larger world one of the most desirable commodities of the time, namely furs, they established a trading post right near the Hudson River. Members of the family probably lived there, not permanently, but from time to time during trading season, and would bring manufactured goods, which they imported from Europe, foodstuffs like sugar, up the Hudson River to their outpost there, and exchange these commodities for the furs that the Indians brought to the trading post. The furs would then be brought down the Hudson and shipped abroad, where they would be manufactured into such desirable things as beaver hats, which were all the rage in Europe at the time.
One of the things that was so attractive for Jews in their lives here in this country is how free they felt, particularly economically, that there were few restrictions on the fields in which they could make a good living. And when they compared that to the various restrictions on their economic life in Europe, they felt blessed. But of course, they were plagued with the same problems that we're plagued with here, that with freedom goes also the freedom to forget one's Jewish life.
I think we were talking about a time where the community was very small, and if people wanted to identify as Jews, the only place they could identify as Jews was in the synagogue in Shereth, Israel, in New York. The amazing thing is that the congregation was able to maintain itself as a cohesive, consistent organization that was able to go from generation to generation in the last 350 years, which is really a remarkable story.
In 1658, not long after Jews arrived in New Amsterdam, a group of 15 families, Jews probably from the island of Barbados, and looking for a New England port town, were attracted to Roger Williams' Rhode Island and his renown for religious freedom.
Newport has several beginnings. You have records of Jews in the 17th century. But Newport as a Jewish community gets going when Newport itself takes off. It becomes an important port. It's a free port. Trade increases, and Jews move in the 1740s, 1750s. Several of them are related to one another, some of them coming direct from the Iberian Peninsula, where they had lived underground for several hundred years, since 1492. They come to Newport, they come out of the closet, so to speak, as Jews, and some of them, Vieira, Lopez, they are very successful, and that, of course, brings other Jews, so that something on the order of 10% of the significant merchants of Newport are Jewish.
For a long, long time, the community was following the Sephardic or Spanish ritual. And to this day, we still have that in our synagogue. They were thrilled beyond belief to be able to practice Judaism publicly. But for them, that meant they could pray in each other's homes. That did not enable them to build a synagogue because they couldn't afford it.
By the middle of the 18th century, approximately 25 families lived in Newport, including Moses Levy, Isaac Hart, and Aaron Lopez, a refugee from the Inquisition and probably one of the most successful merchants and ship owners of the time.
He had been living in Portugal, outwardly as Catholic and privately as Jewish. He and his wife bolted, came to Newport for the first time, had a circumcision performed as an adult, remarried his wife in a Jewish ceremony because the first time it was in a church ceremony.
One of the most exciting episodes and unusual in all of colonial history is Aaron Lopez sending a ship with secret instructions to ferret his half-brother out of Portugal, bring him to Newport, where he comes, returns to Judaism, takes on a new name, and is kind of born again. Again, remember, this is 300 years after Jews have been expelled. And it's also clear that Lopez is keeping tabs on his relatives who are living underground as Jews. So it's really extraordinary.
Lopez made his fortune trading sperm whale oil used for making candles, but he also dealt with slaves.
Aaron Lopez does deal somewhat in slaves as part of his trading activity. You have some Jews who own slaves. It's not very significant in terms of numbers. The history of slavery in this country would be identical if no Jew had come to America and if no Jew had been involved. I think the bottom line is really Jews were not very different from their neighbors when it came to slavery. You had some Jews in New York who were deeply unhappy about slavery, and you have some Jews who clearly had a blind spot. They are like their neighbors in this regard, for better and for worse.
In 1759, the Jews of Newport began work on their synagogue, which was dedicated in 1763.
They built that very beautiful little synagogue, which we know as the Touros Synagogue today. Wasn't its original name, but there you had a community that had really prospered, and this was the demonstration of their newfound prosperity.
Tradition says that it is the fear of the Inquisition that was the cause of what appears to be an escape trapdoor, though there is no evidence. It may just have been an easy way to get to the basement. Unfortunately, the Jewish community of Newport did not recover from the Revolutionary War, since the colony was occupied by the British and its pier was used for firewood. Most of the families had fled. Their naval routes were lost to other ports. Yet the deed to the synagogue stayed in the hands of their sister synagogue, Shereth Israel in New York, securing its future. Much further south, a Jewish presence was also taking root. The colony of Charleston, established in 1670, began seeing Jewish settlers by 1695, drawn in large part to the civil and religious liberty afforded by South Carolina and the economic opportunities available.
After New Amsterdam and Newport, we also find Jews appearing in Charleston in the 1690s and early 1700s. They came, they went, they were always few in number, but there does seem to have been something of a presence that continued from time to time, because very curiously, Jews are spoken of as having voted in an election in Charleston in 1703. Very, very unusual for the times to find Jews participating in public activities, having the right to vote.
The early arrivals of Sephardic Jews came from London, and we can go back as far as 1697, when the governor made 64 settlers citizens of the province of Carolina, which extended from Virginia to the coast of Florida, and 4 were Jews, and we have their names.
Jews were attracted to the port of Charlestown because it was a mercantile center. It was one of the most important commercial centers on the coast of the then colonies. Jews tended to be involved in merchant pursuits, tradesmen, brokers, auctioneers, this sort of thing. So it was a place where they knew they could make a living, and they knew they could practice their faith without interference.
By 1749, there were sufficient numbers to organize Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim, Holy Congregation House of God, KKBE. And 15 years later, the Cumming Street Cemetery, the oldest remaining Jewish burial ground in the South.
The cemetery was a family cemetery started by Isaac da Costa. He bought the land on which the cemetery is located back to 1762. It was listed in some of the documents as a Jews' cemetery. Da Costa sold the cemetery to the congregation in 1764. That's when it became a congregational cemetery. One of the stipulations was that it would be open to all Jews in South Carolina who abided by the Jewish faith. The oldest grave we've identified in the cemetery is of Moses Cohen. Moses Cohen was a religious leader of the congregation when it was founded in 1749. He was the Chazan.
The cemetery also includes some of Charleston's leading Jewish families of the time, including the Minus and the Moise family, of which Anita Moise Rosefield Rosenberg is a descendant.
We are very careful to pass along any history, any items, jewelry of the women, desk things that the men may have had, letter openers, things like that. We pass them along from generation to generation. We want the children who grow up in the family to have a sense of history about our family and its place in the South. This is a beautiful gold bracelet that was a wedding present to Esther Lyon Moise in the 1800s. We know that she wore it. Her initials are engraved on the inside of it. So it is with great pride that my mother passed it on to me. Over the years, my mother collected the thimbles of the ladies in the family. They gave a girl a beautiful gold thimble, usually with her initials carved into it, so that she could learn to sew as Southern ladies did. And Mother had all of these wonderful thimbles put on a bracelet so that when we wear these thimbles, we remember all the ladies in our family who came before us. We remember them because there's nothing more important than a Jewish family. And if you're going to pass that on from generation to generation, the children in the family have to know the history.
Some early settlers looked for a more complete connection to organized faith.
One of my favorite characters from that period is a woman by the name of Rebecca Samuel, who wrote a letter to her parents back in Germany. She wrote to them in Yiddish to reassure them that even though she was living in Virginia, that she would maintain Jewish life in raising her own 2 young children. And she was in fact moving to Charleston, because in Charleston there was a critical mass of Jews.
This is at the end of the 18th century. It's a very powerful statement of what people thought they needed. They needed a minyan, they needed a critical mass to have kosher, a shachit, someone to produce kosher meat, to have a Sabbath service, etc.
In 1794, KKBE built their synagogue. It was destroyed by fire and subsequently rebuilt in 1840, one of the oldest synagogues in the United States. A bit further south, a Jewish community was also beginning in Georgia.
The first Jews who came to Savannah came on July 11th of 1733. It was the largest landing of Jews during the colonial period. They came from London, England. They were sponsored by the Bevis Marks congregation, which is the oldest Jewish congregation in Great Britain. And actually it was different from all the other landings in that they came with a Torah, came with the ability of having services. They had more than enough for a minyan, for prayer, and while they didn't officially establish the congregation until 2 years later and give it its name, Mikveh Israel, they really were a congregation from the very first day that they landed, in that they had a wonderful Torah scroll with them. We still have that Torah scroll in our museum.
When James Oglethorpe opens up Savannah and declares that it is really going to be a place of refuge, then the Jewish community in London sends a ship with Jews who couldn't really earn a living. They were new in London. This was a way of getting rid of people who you were supporting, but they were people who they thought could succeed, and some of them were doctors and so on. James Oglethorpe never in his wildest dreams imagined that he was going to get Jews. He thought, just different branches of Protestants. But fortunately for the Jews, they come at the time of a plague. There is a doctor on board. He's credited with ending the plague. They admit the Jewish community. They don't last very long because the Spaniards are threatening to make war on Georgia. Every Jew of Spanish and Portuguese extraction knew that if Spain won that war, the Inquisition would come and they would be in serious trouble. So within 8 years, only the 2 Ashkenazim remain, and everybody else moves away.
The Scheftel and Minus families from Germanic backgrounds stayed, and in 1774, with 4 other Jewish families, they endeavored to function as a congregation. Marion Mendel is a descendant of the Scheftel family.
Mordecai Scheftel was a merchant. He was a tanner. He was a landowner. He acquired a lot of real estate, and he had amassed quite a bit of money. He was worth a lot. When the colonists first came over, they held services in each other's homes, which of course at that time were huts, tents. In the minutes are mentioned the fact that the services were held in Mordecai Scheftel's home. It was through his efforts that they probably built the first synagogue in Georgia, and he gave the land that had been deeded to him for the purpose of establishing a cemetery for all Jews.
They began operating under the name Kahal Kodosh Mikvah Israel.
The Jewish community in Savannah, I think, represented really the ebb and flow of the fortunes of Savannah. When things are doing well here, the Jewish community would grow, and when things were not doing well, it would somewhat diminish. It wasn't really until after the Revolution and the establishment of the United States that the community was totally and completely entrenched and secure.
Mordecai Scheftel became the highest-ranking Jewish officer of the American Revolutionary Forces and was taken prisoner along with his son, Scheftel.
This chair figures in this sketch here of Scheftel, and he's wearing the costume of a revolutionary soldier and a cocked hat. And we have the cocked hat that came down through all these years. He was the last person to discard the wearing of the colonial soldier, and for that reason he was known as cocked hat. I have Mordecai Scheftel's shoe buckles, his toddy cup. He was a very observant Jew, and he kept kosher, and when he went out into the countryside, he wanted to be sure that the eating utensils that he used were kosher, and he carried his little scout kit with him. I feel that I'm very fortunate because I have lots and lots of old documents and papers that are of historical import. We're fortunate that they had enough of a feeling for history that they kept them safe.
After the war, in 1790, Congregation Mikvah Israel was incorporated under the Scheftel leadership. Their first synagogue structure was destroyed by fire in 1829. Their present synagogue was consecrated in 1878. Philadelphia, like the other major colonies, was attractive as a port and drew permanent Jewish settlers in 1737.
In the same period of time when something was being tried in Savannah, there was also the development of a small Jewish presence in Philadelphia. A few Jews came from New York City down to Philadelphia in 1737, 1738, and evidently they were intent on staying because in the early 1740s they acquired land for a cemetery.
Nathan Levy had a daughter and had to be buried, so he wanted to be buried in a Jewish cemetery, and therefore he bought the plot, which still exists now, and exists on 8th Street and Spruce.
Shortly after, the Franks brothers, David and Moses, joined the Levies, beginning the nucleus of the Philadelphia Jewish community. David Franks launched the career of Bernard Gratz, who, along with his brother Michael, provided leadership for the 100-strong, committed Jewish men and women found in Philadelphia on the eve of the Revolution.
The thing about the Philadelphia Jewish community is that it has this remarkable group of women. Rebecca Machado Phillips bore 21 children, but she also was a sustainer of her synagogue, and she left a legacy to the synagogue, and she was involved in business activities as well. She gives us a full portrait of what women's lives were like in that era, if we can imagine a life spent so much in childbearing and child rearing. She and Grace Nathan raised money to buy the ritual objects for the synagogue.
The congregation still retains the Torah crowns, created by the premier Jewish silver artisan of the time, Meyer Myers. During the Revolutionary War, Philadelphia became the safe haven for many of the Jewish colonists who had pledged their alliance to the American side, including Gershom Mendesatius, who fled New York with his congregation and their Torahs. This enabled the colony's original Jewish population to construct a permanent synagogue, aided by donations from Jews and non-Jews alike, including £5 from Benjamin Franklin. Perhaps due to a combination of factors, the relatively inhospitable religious climate, the agrarian economy when Jews were primarily merchants, and the lack of a major urban center, Richmond was the last of the original 6 Jewish congregations. It began to develop as Virginia itself opened up economically and began to flourish.
In 1784-1785, Virginia ended religious qualifications as a requirement for voting or for service in office. And therefore Jews became emancipated as well in Virginia. And this may help explain why Richmond suddenly began to be a place where Jews would head for and settle, and a new Jewish community developed.
Although there were Jewish settlers like Isaiah Isaacs and Jacob Cohen as early as 1769, only after the War of Independence and Virginia's Act for Religious Freedom, originally drafted by Thomas Jefferson in 1779, did the community get underway. This stated that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities.
And in 1789, they established the first congregation in the colony of Virginia, which was Beth Shalom Congregation, right here in Richmond.
Claire Milheiser Rosenbaum is a descendant of the Levis and Ezekiels, 2 early Jewish Richmond families.
There were 29 adult males who signed the article of bylaws to establish the congregation, and we can only assume that there were women and children, but they are not included in the census or in the signing of the bylaws of the congregation.
In 1791, the dedication of the first Jewish cemetery in Virginia took place at the Franklin Street Burial Ground, donated by Isaiah Isaacs and where Richmond's earliest Jews are buried. The War of Independence marked a turning point of sorts for Jews, primarily in the area of political freedom.
First of all, the Jews themselves took a very bold step during the Revolution, and they decided to take sides, to actually participate. This is, as far as I know, the first time in modern history anywhere that Jews took a political position, became part of the political fabric. They didn't have to do this. There was no pressure on them to choose sides. A great many of them, though, chose the American side. A small number of them chose the British side. They felt comfortable enough and secure enough to be able to openly embrace and support and be part of a political position. Now, thanks to that, after the Revolution, Jews pointed to their service, particularly on the American side, in advancing the case for political equality.
One of those was Francis Salvador, who served in the South Carolina Assembly at the age of 27. He was the first Jew to die in the Revolutionary War at the age of 29.
A vigorous, idealistic young man who comes to South Carolina, who's a planter, owns a whole bunch of land somewhere in South Carolina, who's the first Jew in the New World, really the first Jew in the world, elected to a popular assembly. And then he enlists in the Revolutionary Army, and he's killed in the service of his country.
Their military service helped their claim for political parity.
They pointed to the fact that they had devoted themselves and their personal possessions, their wealth, such as it was, to the American side. And thus they made the claim that we participated in support of the American Revolution, and shouldn't there be acknowledgement of that by inclusion in the body politic?
So it is no surprise the joy that the Jews felt with the federal Constitution in 1787 and the Bill of Rights in 1791, which outlawed religious tests as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States, and forbade Congress from making any law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. A gala parade marking the ratification of the Constitution was held in Philadelphia on July 4th, 1788, and members of Christian denominations, as well as the Jewish community, walked arm in arm, evidence of the equality of all religions in the young country. The 6 Jewish congregations were also pleased by the election of George Washington as president of the young nation, and wound up writing letters of congratulations, the first from Savannah, the second from Newport, and the third from the other 4 congregations.
What's so interesting is how, at the earliest opportunity, these communities want to express their individualism so that right after the American Revolution, there is not a single letter to George Washington from the Jewish community, you know, all uniting under New York. On the contrary, he gets 3 different letters from different communities, and the correspondence makes clear that that is no accident. They want to express the fact that just as each colony was different and each state is different and each Protestant church is different, so each synagogue is going to be different, and that congregational model becomes important.
Moses Seixas wrote the letter from the Newport congregation. Deprived as we heretofore have been of the invaluable rights of free citizens, we now, with a deep sense of gratitude to the Almighty Disposer of all events, behold a government erected by the majesty of the people, a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution. And Washington responded.
We have the very bold step taken by George Washington in 1790 in his well-known letter to the Jewish community of Newport. Washington spoke of the Jews as being citizens, as being members of the body politic. And this was the first time anywhere in Western society in the modern era in which the head of a state reached out to and embraced the Jewish population as equal members of the society. This had to have a very powerful impact because, after all, this was George Washington, literally the father of the country.
Newport commemorates this event by reading Washington's letter in an annual ceremony at Truro Synagogue.
Distinguished citizens of this wonderful community and congregation, it is my privilege to read President George Washington's response, in which the President set the standard for religious freedom and civil liberties in America. To the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island. Gentlemen, while I receive with much satisfaction your address replete with expressions of affection and esteem, I rejoice in the opportunity for happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. It would be inconsistent. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. May the Father of all mercies scatter.
The commitment the colonists had shown in the pre-revolutionary and revolutionary periods to fulfill their political, military, and social responsibilities and becoming more fully integrated in their young country showed concrete results in the early national period. Communities such as Charleston were strengthened economically.
From 1790, in other words, after the Revolution, until 1820, Charleston has the largest Jewish population in the United States, larger than New York City, larger than Philadelphia. And the reason for that, I think, is the same reason that it was true in the colonial period. I think that it had a flourishing economy, its connection to the Caribbean, its economic opportunity.
A Jewish communal infrastructure continued to openly develop.
The first benevolent society in America was founded by members of this congregation in 1784. They took care of indigents and also new immigrants, and was like a burial society. It's called the Hebrew Benevolent Society, still in existence. The other organization is the Hebrew Orphan Society, founded in 1801, the oldest orphan society in America. They had a home for orphans and widows here, and was also a school building for the students.
The Jewish community had reached a point that they could produce important leaders.
Mordecai Manuel Noah is really the first person we can talk about who is truly a leader in the general community, a political leader. At one time he's head of Tammany Hall, and is a very important newspaper editor in New York. And at the same time, he is the best known Jew of his day, someone who has been active in Jewish affairs as a lay leader. He is really someone who lives in two worlds and is interested in the relationship between these worlds. He's courageously standing up for Jewish rights, and when he himself feels that he's been the victim of anti-Semitism, he says, "This is America, I can fight for my rights." And yet at the same time, he is deeply involved in American politics. He insists that the fact that he's a Jew should not prevent him from holding office. And really the first person we know who succeeds in both realms.
Rebecca Grotz's work helped define a new identity for Jewish women.
She creates the first Jewish female organization outside of the synagogue in 1819, the Female Hebrew Benevolent Association. And why did she do it? She's part of a group of Philadelphia women, Jewish women and Christian women, who've been providing charity to the poor in Philadelphia, and she knows the Christians missionize when they go out, and she doesn't want them to missionize among the Jewish poor. So she's picking up on the charge that Stuyvesant was told when he was told the Jews can stay, but their poor shall not become a burden to the community. So she brackets it very nicely for the end of this period because she wants to take care of the Jewish poor.
I think that's the legacy they left us. Faithfulness to tradition, and at the same time openness to society, openness to the world, participating in the world to the best of our ability, participating openly as Jews, as Americans, as people committed to the highest values that we represent.
Those Jews who went to Newport or Savannah or Charleston or Philadelphia were not so much unlike the people looking for new opportunities now. They went to places where there were no Jewish institutions waiting for them. There were no Jewish services that were ready to greet them and ask, what can we do for you? But rather they had to create it for themselves. And the degree to which this was important to them, the degree to which they combined their risk-taking in the new world, moving into a place that was kind of uncharted, willing to build their own lives and the life of a community from the ground up in a piecemeal fashion is, I think, I find it a very stirring story.
Colonial Jews played a critical role in establishing themselves as a political group on the American scene. In contrast to Jews in many other places, these Jews began to assert their rights and ask for the possibility of participating in the political process.
Hallelujah, hallelujah, b'tzil tzalei Shama.
In subsequent centuries, American Jews followed in the path blazed by colonial American Jewry, and they discovered that America is a land of opportunity. And like colonial American Jews, they embraced those opportunities and participated in the adventure that is America.
The challenges that Jews faced 350 years ago are so similar to the challenges that we face today. Jews have, in a sense, never been more successful in this country. We've never been more integrated. We've never felt more comfortable as Americans. But with that comfort and ease and success comes the challenge of how to maintain ourselves as a vital Jewish community in the United States. How to be concerned with Jewish survival when, in a sense, we don't need to be concerned about anything. And that really is our challenge as we move forward for the next 350 years.
Shira